All right. Welcome, everyone. We're so thrilled that you're here and interested to learn a little bit more about the Regeneron Science Talent Search. My name is Allie Stiefel, and I am the director of Regeneron STS at Society for Science, the nonprofit that owns and produces the competition. And I'm here today with my colleague, Elaine, and I will let her introduce herself.
Thank you, Allie. Hi, everybody. My name is Elaine Edwards, and I am the specialist for the Regeneron Science Talent Search. We are so excited to talk to you today about some of the elements of winning applications. So thank you so much for being here.
Great. Thank you, Elaine. We hope that by now you've opened your application. That's a great place to start, but we know you're here because you're interested. And we hope that maybe you've tuned into our previous 3 webinars. We've held a few other webinars this application cycle. If you've missed them, never fear. On our website, you can find full recordings and learn about topics like myth busting, busting common myths about the competition, answering your questions. So questions that we frequently receive from students. We tackled that early on, and a basic overview of the competition as well. So if you're curious about any of those things, definitely check out our prior sessions. Tonight, like Elaine said, we're going to talk about winning applications. What does it take to become one of the top 300 scholars or one of the top 40 finalists in the competition? So Elaine and I, full disclosure, we are not the judges. Believe it or not, we don't actually score your applications, and we don't pick the winners. However, we do write the application, we draft the rubric, we recruit all of the scientists. So we do help to shape this process, and we know what it's designed to do. We have some special guests who will also tell you their perspective on what a winning application looks like. But to backtrack a bit, what is the Science Talent Search and what does it really look for? It's important to address these things because they might be a little bit different than what you're used to hearing and seeing in other science research competitions. Regeneron STS is sponsored by Regeneron, and it's the nation's oldest and most prestigious science research competition for high school seniors. So hopefully you are here as a high school senior, you're a student in your final year of high school, and you're either a US citizen who lives abroad or any student living and going to school in the United States. You can learn more about eligibility in some of our other sessions. STS looks for the future leaders in science. So we don't just look for the best research in a given year. That's what ISEF does. That's our sister competition. Instead, we're looking through every single section of your application, which includes test scores, recommendations, essays, all kinds of things to learn more about you. And we're going to talk about how those are important and how we evaluate them tonight. The Science Talent Search also is a big opportunity to win money, and that's probably why you're here. So every year we award 300 top scholars with $2,000 each, and their schools receive $2,000 as well. And we award the top 40 finalists with $25,000 each and the opportunity to win additional prizes of up to $250,000. So we understand why you're interested in what a winning application looks like. And we're going to give you some of our favorite tips and tricks tonight of how to take advantage and really put your best self forward. Before we do that and share our perspective and learnings over the past, and collectively, Elaine and I have about 15 years of experience just on this program. And so we're eager to share with you what we've gleaned from those years. But we have a very special guest today, Dr. Jason Valentine of Vanderbilt University. Dr. Valentine is the chair of the Regeneron STS judging panel. That means he's the head judge of the competition. He has served on the panel for many years. And he has graciously agreed to share his top advice for students like you who are entering STS this year. So let's give it up for Dr. Valentine.
Hi, my name is Jason Valentine. I'm a professor of mechanical engineering at Vanderbilt University, and I'm also chair of the judging committee for the Regeneron STS competition. I want to take a few minutes to give you some pointers on filling out an application. First of all, each year we get so many fantastic applicants. It makes our life as judges pretty challenging. In order to separate applicants and determine who's the semifinalist group, who's the finalist group, we need a fairly long application. So my first pointer is to start early. This is not an application that you want to put off to the last minute. There are several different parts of the application, and each part is read by the judges, and each part is important. So I want to step through them and give you some pointers on each. You're going to have essay questions. This is a chance for us to get to know you. What drives you? What challenges have you overcome? We are not looking for perfection in an applicant. Future leaders in science are going to come from many different walks of life in many different forms. Tell us what makes you that. What makes you a future leader? With examples, okay? You're going to have reference letter writers. Make sure that you choose people that know you, that can talk specifically about you and what makes you so fantastic. Moving into the research section, you're going to have some essay questions about your research project. Let us know what drove you to this research, what drove you to this project. If it's your idea, how did you come up with the idea? What drives you as a scientist? Okay, again, we want to get to know you through this application. You're going to have a section where you describe your contributions to your project. You need to be specific here, okay? We get projects from across the spectrum, from university labs to high school research labs to home garages. And every project has a different level of mentoring, okay? It's fine to have a mentor. You just need to be specific about what your contribution was and what you got help with. What is against the rules is to have help on a project and not acknowledge it, okay? Please be specific in that section. Finally, moving on to the project description. Your project description is going to be read by PhDs in your field of study. It's also going to be read by PhDs who are not directly in your field of study. So you need to be able to balance the depth and breadth of your project so that both experts in your field can appreciate your contributions and experts outside of your field can appreciate your contributions and what makes your project so special. And that's a challenging thing to do. And it's a thing that you'll have to do throughout your career as a scientist. So time to get practice. That's about it. The fact that you're watching this means you're at least considering submitting an application. And I really hope you do. I hope you submit a fantastic one and make our lives as judges really challenging. And if things go well, hopefully I'll see you in March for finalists judging.
All right. And again,
Hi.
thank you to Dr. Jason Valentine for sharing that advice. And we completely agree with him that something to keep in mind in this process is that Regeneron STS is a competitive program. We're used to seeing very high caliber applications come through from almost every single entrant, probably just like yours, which is one reason why we wanted to do this session tonight about little ways to make things stand out. So with that, I'll turn it over to Elaine.
All right, thank you, Allie, and thank you to Jason as well for those excellent points of advice. The things that we're going to say today are going to be things that you might have heard before, but they might be totally new to you. And so we will mostly get started here with covering some of the basics that you will want to make sure that you have done in your application that we do see as being common to a lot of the winners who make it through STS. So one of the big things here, if you don't mind hitting the next point for me, Allie. This is a pretty easy and obvious one, but definitely want to make sure that you and your project fit the eligibility criteria. If you don't know what that criteria is, you'll definitely want to take a look at our rules book. This is updated at the top of every cycle. So even if you've taken a look at it in past years, just out of curiosity, always a good idea to make sure that you're familiar with the most recent rules and regulations. But some of the things to keep in mind is, as we've said, this is a competition for high school seniors. It is a competition for those who are living and attending school here in the United States, or for those of US citizenship who are living abroad. So there are some specific citizenship requirements you'll want to make sure that you're up on if you're interested in applying. Also, things like STS does not accept team research. So you'll want to make sure that you're submitting an independent investigation as the project along with your application package. So a couple other things that you'll definitely find in the rules book. So make sure to take a look there before you go ahead and submit your application to STS. But another thing you'll want to look at here is, as we've just said, you'll want to make sure you follow the rules, but also that you have the right paperwork. So after taking a look at the rules, you'll see that we have some very specific guidelines, especially if you're working with things like vertebrate animals, with human participants, with PHBAs. All of those things are going to require some specialized paperwork. And you don't want to get caught without that. It's very important for us to be able to follow your research process, but also to be sure that you were safe as a researcher and that you were keeping others safe. Task 3 in the application is going to help guide you through that. So definitely, again, take a look at that if you haven't already. Our team is also here to help with any specific rules questions. You can shoot us an email at sts@societyforscience.org for specific rules questions. But again, just a good idea to review that rules book in full. Another thing that you'll want to make sure, again, seems obvious, but we'd like to remind students of it every year, make sure that your application is complete. So this means that all of the required tasks you'll want to make sure to submit. There are some tasks in the application that are optional, and it is totally fine if you choose not to do those. That is not what we mean when we say a complete application. We want those required tasks. What this also means is that you want to make sure that all of your answers to everything are complete, that you have left no required question blank, and also that your answers are pretty robust. Short answers are fine in some situations, and others you'll want to make sure to give us some of the background of your answers. So again, just make sure that that application is done in full. And along those lines, you're also going to want to make sure that your application is submitted by the deadline. So again, another one that seems obvious, but can really be heartbreaking if it doesn't happen. Maybe you filled out the entire application way in advance. You say, I'll come back and submit later. Don't wait, we say. As soon as you have finished or completed all the required tasks, you are able to submit. And the best news is that if you wish to go back and edit things, you still can. We have an application tour in which we teach you how to edit tasks. And so definitely recommend taking a look at that video series if you need guidance there, because you definitely don't want to get caught in a situation where you've done it, but you thought you'd want to go back and edit. And so you forget to submit when that deadline rolls around. So definitely as soon as you can get that application in, go back and edit things by all means if you need to. But we'll definitely want to see it in that application pool on November 9th, 2022 at 8 p.m. ET. While we're on the topic of a deadline, a good thing to remind you as well is that our application support deadline is 24 hours before the deadline. So that's November 8th at 8 p.m. What that means is if you or say a recommender is having trouble, if you submit that problem to us by email by that deadline, we guarantee that we'll get you a response and get your situation resolved. Anything submitted after that time, we can't guarantee that just because of the high volume of questions and issues that we receive in those last 24 hours. So again, definitely a good idea to submit in advance. All right, and our last thing here, we need your recommendations. That is crucial to us for a variety of reasons. One of them is, again, you have a project mentor there who's going to help us verify some crucial things about your research. Again, whether you followed the rules, whether you were being safe, other approvals that you might have received, they're going to help tell us about the independence of your research. So that's really important. But other things like your educator recommendation, that's important to us too. We want to be able to know what you're like in a classroom. Similarly, that high school report, that gives us some really important information about your school, about graduation rates, maybe about how COVID affected your school environment. We say all the time that context is really important for STS. And so in total, those recommendations are really, really beneficial part of your application package. Important to note, your applications will still be considered if those recommendations aren't in. But it is definitely a little more difficult for our judges to place you in the context of the application pool without those recommendations. So those in total are some of the basics that you'll want to look at as you're thinking about what makes a winning application.
Yeah, absolutely, Elaine. And just like she said, some of these might seem obvious, but we list them here because we see them every single year, and we want you to avoid the heartbreak that we've seen from other students. So definitely do follow these tips. One special note about submitting your application, it actually can take several minutes to get through those tasks. So even another reason to not wait until the last minute, you want to make sure we receive your entry. Don't wait until 7:59, the deadline day. Make sure you're doing it ahead of time because you might get stuck by the clock there. Like Elaine also said, context is extremely important to reviewing your application. If you're just giving us some of the basic facts about what you did, that's great, but it's great for us to know even more about the environment in which you worked and what was available to you. So one tip we have is to make sure that your contribution to the research is clear. The reason we say this is just like Dr. Valentine said, we know that there are many paths for high school students to do research, right? Like maybe you have a research class at your high school, and that's fantastic. That means that you might have kind of a lab setting or a teacher or a mentor who's helping you. It might mean that you have still some limited resources because everyone in your school works with similar materials, and that's totally fine, but it's also helpful for us to know. Maybe your circumstance is also very different where you have no one around you who can lead you through the research process. So you very much did it yourself in your garage. And so maybe it took you a little longer to find your results or to work on your experiments because you didn't have someone there and you were figuring things out. So it might look like you have less data, but there's a really good reason why. Another point of context, you got accepted into a really competitive research program. That's great too, but you might have more resources than others, and that would explain it. It's also important in terms of your contribution to the research to tell us about what you did, especially if you worked with a lab group or with other people. As you probably know, for STS, we do not permit team research, so research conducted with other high school students is not eligible for this competition. So what we mean here is if you worked in a lab with other adults or college students, and maybe you're published on a paper, maybe it was just a huge group effort, let us know what you did specifically. It's not realistic to assume that every single entrant did their whole project by themselves from start to finish. That's not normal in most fields of science, right? And so we understand that's going to be atypical here as well. But it will really help us to pinpoint what you did in relation to what the full lab did, where you were creative versus where someone else in the lab kind of presented a problem. It also is helpful for us when maybe you're published with a group, which you don't have to be, which I think we get into here in a minute. But you letting us know what you did is really, really important for a variety of reasons. Be honest about how you spend your time. So when we talk about the Science Talent Search being different than other research competitions out there and how we're looking for future leaders in science, one of the things we ask for is for you to tell us about your activities and extracurriculars, or how we like to phrase it, how you spend your time. We know it can be really tempting to send us the fanciest things on your resume, right? Like that one time you did this fancy program and you were accepted to it, and that's very, very cool. We like to hear about the awards that you've won, but even more importantly, the reason why we phrase it how you spend your time is because it gives us context into then how much time you spend on your project and how you prioritize that in your life, right? Or maybe there were certain challenges you had to overcome to get that time. And if it doesn't seem like a lot, that's okay. It was still important to you. So if you have familial obligations, like you have to babysit siblings after school, you're helping grandparents, you have an after school job, list that stuff, right? Like do a time exercise where you think about how you spend your time in a given week, and make sure that those top activities really are reflected in your application. We want to know about your real life, not just the fancy parts. Explain the why in your answers. Again, sometimes this seems obvious, but it's one of the reasons there are so many essays and text boxes in our application. We don't just collect your research paper. There are several other tasks that give you opportunity to explain some of the why that maybe doesn't always fit in your research paper, right? So tell us why you decided to do this research, explain every small decision that you've made the best that you can, but definitely important to not just give us the fact about what you did, but when you explain why, you're also explaining that or showing us that you understand how it works and why those decisions were made. Tell us what's important to you. Something I always like to tell students in this process, because this is very much about you as a human being and not just about the research that you've conducted, although that's important too. Make sure that you're really reflected in your application, you as the actual human. Make a list of like 5 or 6 things that are really important to you and who you are, like almost like a thesis statement as a human, right? Like, what do you stand for? And then go through the process and then go back to that list and make sure those things are in there, right? This is another thing that makes this process a little different than a normal science research competition. And that's why we're sharing this advice with you today. Show us what's unique about you and what you care about. And show us your personality. It's totally fine to not give perfectly composed answers and sound like a robot, right? We know, again, that you're a real human being with a big personality, most likely, and that you have things that you like that I'm not into or Elaine's not into, and vice versa, right? That's how we all make the world go around, is to celebrate what's unique about each and every one of us. So don't be afraid to put something in your application that maybe you think is different, that you might not always be willing to share. We're cool with that. We like to see personality. Sometimes students are so concerned about coming across as very professional, which is a great thing, but also we know you're teenagers, so you don't feel like you have to hide it for us. And last but not least here, make sure your application tells the story of you and your research from start to finish. If it's not there in writing, we don't know. And that's just the truth. This is a written competition. We've talked about before, we don't accept any external links. So our judges and evaluators cannot click on links to view additional materials or videos. So just don't include them. If you include them, they're not going to be able to click on them anyway. So just a reminder, if it's not there in writing, we don't know. So make sure you incorporate these things within your answers in the application.
All right, so we've told you about some of the things that you definitely want to look out for as you're making your application and that you want to make sure to include or do. But we've also come across in winning applications some things that they don't spend as much of their time worrying about. Things that are definitely or sometimes important, but definitely not things that you should worry about, and that we want to assure students are not going to count against you the majority of the time. So one of those top things I think here is our spelling and grammar. And so definitely, again, like Ali said, professionalism is great. You want to present the best version of yourself that's possible. And of course, great spelling and grammar help with that. But if you misspell a word, if you use the wrong word in a situation, that's absolutely not going to count against you. We all make mistakes from time to time, and we completely understand, especially when the greater point of your meaning, the greater point of your story is coming across. So don't worry about your spelling and grammar so much. Another thing not to spend too much time worrying about, like we said, STS is not looking for perfection. That means you don't need to have perfect test scores, a perfect GPA or grades. Test scores are one of the optional tasks in our application. STS has been test optional for many years, meaning that if you choose not to submit your test scores with your application, that is not going to count against you. Of course, you're also welcome to do so. But again, in the situation that you do not spend your time worrying about if your test scores are good enough to submit, if your GPA is good enough. Again, what really matters to us is context. So maybe you don't think your GPA is super high, but maybe you have some really outstanding activities, really outstanding research that could absolutely make the difference for you. So don't spend too much time worrying about those test scores. Another thing that doesn't matter too much to us is where you did your research. In a bit, we'll get into some of the statistics of our finalists and scholars, but you will see for yourself that research comes from all kinds of places. You don't need to have a fancy mentor, fancy lab. You can do research at home. Similarly, fancy mentors, fancy labs, also amazing. We really don't discriminate against where you're doing your research or how you're getting to science. The important thing is that you're here, and we really want to celebrate that. All right, another thing not to worry too much about is how long you spent on your research. The important thing here is the process, is your contribution, the independence of the work. Definitely to an extent, the results that you've received. We want to see what you did with your hypothesis, what you did with your curiosity. But one thing that doesn't matter in that whole process is really how long it took you. Maybe your research only took a couple months. Maybe you spent a couple years on it. Both of those things are completely fine. And while I'm here, I'll also mention, I said a couple years, that might be something you're unfamiliar with coming to our competition as well, is that you can submit research from any year of high school. So if you're a senior, but you're really proud of a project that you did in your sophomore year, you are welcome to submit that as the research project along with your application package. Similarly, that's research conducted over any length of time. So you are more than welcome to submit research that took place over a couple of years. Likewise, you don't have to. If it's a couple of weeks, totally fine too. And on that note, how long you spent on your application? Like we've said up until this point, it's important to absolutely spend time on your application. We want to see that you've put thought into your answers and your responses. But at the same time, you do not absolutely have to have spent months on an application to be successful. You could have spent a couple weeks on it. So again, that's not really something to worry about as you're completing the application. And finally, the length of your answers or research paper. So this one should probably have a little asterisk. In terms of the length of the research paper, there are some hard limits on this that you will want to look at in our rules book. So namely, we do have a page limit. It's 20-page limit for your research paper. That does not include your title page, your abstract, or your bibliography. Everything else, and so that's a table of contents, an appendix, acknowledgements, all of those things, as nice as they are, they do count toward your page limit. And so you will just want to be really conscious that you are not going over that 20 pages. However, what this point here means is that if you have a 10-page research paper, and that is a complete paper with some excellent results, excellent methodology, that is absolutely going to be as successful to us as a 20-page paper with the same. So the length of that within that 20-page limit, that does not matter as much to us. Similarly, the length of your answers in the application itself.
Yeah, that's all completely true. As we allude to sometimes we've really seen it all. So while Elaine and I are not the judges, we do read a lot of applications for a variety of reasons in our application cycle, and we really get to know the top 40 applications very well each year. And we really have seen it all. So we've seen finalists with very short research papers. Sometimes that's dependent on discipline too. That's more dependent on discipline. It might be formatted in a certain way, or how long students spend on the research. So when we say these things, don't matter, there aren't cutoffs or that sort of thing, or not to feel bad if you don't fit the mold that's in your head of what you have to be an STS finalist. We really mean it. We've really seen it all over the years. All right, so some other big things to keep in mind that don't really matter in our process. One is that you have a famous mentor. This is true. So sometimes students will try to get a recommendation from a well-known scientist who either knows them or not. I would say don't bother doing this unless the person was directly involved in your research. Someone who barely knows you, who's writing a recommendation, doesn't really help your application in any way. You're far better off to choose someone who knows you and who knows your research very well. On the same note, we get a lot of questions about who from my lab should complete my project recommendation. And sometimes the student wants the PI or the principal investigator or the head of the lab to write a letter instead of the graduate student who actually directly mentored the student, thinking that for us, it would be more impressive. 9 times out of 10, the graduate student or the other person in the lab, and maybe it's the PI, that's great too, but the person who worked with you most closely and can actually say what you did on the research is going to give you a much better recommendation that is more helpful to us than the famous person who doesn't know you. The other thing not to worry about is novel research or proving your hypothesis. A lot of students think that in order to enter STS, you have to do something completely groundbreaking that has never been done before, ever, to be successful in this program. And that is just not true. We do see quite a bit of it. We see a lot of it enter the competition as well. But if you're doing something very well, very thoroughly, that's still adding to your field, that's fantastic. So again, a lot of that goes back to circumstances of how you found yourself doing research to begin with. So we don't hold that against a student. If you've done a great project that you designed and you didn't prove your hypothesis, you just proved that you didn't prove it, right? So don't let that get you down either. We see that a lot of students whose projects went in a completely different way than they thought they were going to go when they started, make it to the finals and make it to the top 10 as well. So if you can explain why, that's always a bonus, right? But we know, don't count yourself out just because your project didn't work the way you maybe thought that it would. The other thing we don't care about is if you've published your research or not, or competed in other competitions or have patents. All these things are great. Maybe you do, maybe you don't, maybe you're at the beginning of the process of applying for these things where someone else is a year ahead of you just based on the project that they've done. We don't hold it against a student, of course, at all, if you haven't achieved any of those things. Again, a lot of it comes back to context and circumstance and who's guiding you and how would you know how to do that in some circumstances. So we understand all of that. If you have published, that's great. You're allowed to enter STS. It's really good for us to know, but know that that's not certainly a requirement of doing well in this program. The other thing you don't have to do is only be involved in science activities. That's another question that we get a lot. Students will ask, you know, if this program is about scientific leaders of the future, identifying those types of people, but I don't have a lot of science-based activities on my resume or to write about in my application, except for my research, should I bother applying? And the answer to that is yes, you should definitely bother to apply. We also understand, again, context and circumstance, that not every high school has a science club or a math club or whatever. And so sometimes your opportunities are more limited. Or maybe you didn't discover that you liked science or were good at it or wanted to pursue something like this until later in your high school career. So we understand these things, but tell us, right? Tell us, you know, I've been a really, really dedicated competitive soccer player, or I have this part-time job that limits how much time I can spend in clubs at school. So I chose to prioritize this other type of club, but I still love science, and that's why. So tell us about the reasons why, and that's great for us to know. Absolutely. How you got your start. Elaine talked about this as well, but you know, we do not discriminate against entrants at all on how they got involved in research to begin with. So whether it's just because you saw, you know, program on TV and then that inspired your entire project and you did it all yourself, that's great. If your parent is a scientist and hooked you up with a spot in their lab, that's great too. We don't discriminate on how a student got their start. We support and encourage all of it. The kicker, though, is that you need to share, right? If there's any sort of conflict of interest or something we should know about a relative supporting your journey, please do share that with us. It's a mandatory disclosure in the application. So it's just good for us to know as people write recommendations and to suss that out. But how you got your start can come from anywhere, and we respect that. Other thing not to worry about is where you're from. This comes up quite a bit. A lot of students are worried when they apply that, you know, no one from my school has ever applied before. Similarly, we get questions about, you know, certainly the competition must favor students from a certain state because there are so many students from that state that make it to the finals. Our process doesn't actually value where you're from in that sense at all. Most of the time, if you see a lot of students from a certain state doing well in the program, that's because we got a lot of applications from that state. That's the truth. And we see that pattern every single year. So yeah, where you're from in that sense doesn't matter, but it does matter in that we do want to know where you're from and to know about your high school. That's where, again, the high school report from your counselor is helpful to us, where they send us your transcripts, but they also tell us about your high school, what's the graduation rate, that kind of thing, which is just good to know about what kind of support that you might have in that environment. Great. Now we have some visuals we wanted to share with you about how you might fit in with scholars and finalists of the past. So we're going to explain what some of these next slides are. I'll let Elaine take the first one here. But that's the point, is we wanted to show you that you can be, maybe you see yourself in some of this data, or you put yourself in the shoes of students who've come before you and done well in the competition, that you really can come from anywhere.
Great, thanks, Allie. And so this actually touches on something that Allie was just talking about, which is where our finalists really come from. And so we thought it would be interesting, again, just to dive into the data and see what that says. So over here on the left side of the screen, these are the 2022 finalists, where they came from by residence and where they came from by school. So sometimes a student lives in a different state than where they attend school. So that's why the discrepancy. But you can see pretty wide variety. There are definitely some where the numbers are higher. A lot of the time that correlates to population. So I know that for our scholars, for instance, last year, they came from, I think, 37 states in 3 different countries. So again, just a huge variety. In total, the finalists came from 18 states by residence and 19 by school. Over here on the right, we've collected the past 10 years of historical data, just of these like top 10 states by population, or sorry, by a number of finalists. And that's kind of the point that we want to emphasize here, is that a lot of times it does correlate based on just the population of the state. We receive a lot of applicants from certain states just because they tend to have more people. Of course, that's not at all a problem. Definitely, we'd love to see finalists from New York, from California, those states. Also love to see applications from states that are not as populous. And so we definitely want to encourage folks from those states. Don't feel like you're at some sort of disadvantage. STS doesn't have any kind of quotas, regional caps, anything like that. The only thing you need to do in order to apply is open an application and submit it. So definitely when you see numbers like this and think, oh, like someone from my state's never done it, don't let that be a deterrent to you.
Yeah, very well said. All right, another topic that comes up a lot, research environment. So where you did your project and how successful that might make you in this process. We get a lot of questions from students who tell us, I did my research at home. Like maybe I had a mentor who mentored me virtually, maybe I didn't at all, but our homegrown projects as valued for STS as projects that were done in a lab. We've especially gotten this question a lot over the last couple of years, as you can imagine, in the pandemic, as students were trying to do research in the home environment. We're proud to say that it shows no certainly no, what is the word I'm looking for? There's no impact, right? There is impact in that students who do home research do just as well in this competition. What we see really about a third of the projects, or slightly higher than that some years, are conducted at a home environment. Our scholars last year, almost over 2/3 of them conducted their research in a home environment, and the same was true of finalists. So if you're worried your project may not be competitive because you did it at home, don't worry about that, because our data shows that makes no difference whatsoever. Students are doing great research. In fact, I think our top first place winners the last 2 or 3 years in a row all did their research at home, if that tells you anything.
All right, and the next thing we have on the screen here for you is sort of the category breakdown of what scholars selected for their category and what finalists selected. And so a couple of really interesting insights here. One is that definitely categories, there were people who submitted in all kinds of categories. One thing that you might not know and that is important to stress is that, again, no quotas in terms of category. So if we have a bunch of people who submit in one category, say behavioral science, there is no requirement that an equal number of folks or a percentage, the similar percentage of those folks end up in the finalist pool. Similarly, if you are not at all sure about your category because maybe it's super interdisciplinary, the research that you're doing, you can think about your category choice as being the choice of the evaluator who is going to take a look at your application. So you're choosing the expertise of who is going to review your research. And we are always going to have your back on that. If your evaluator says, hey, I don't have any idea how to read this, we are going to make sure it gets in front of someone who can adequately evaluate the work that you've done. But yeah, an insight here that I thought was interesting is we had so many people submit in computational biology that are here as scholars, and I don't see any in our finalists last year, how that ended up. So again, that just proves that the game, the quotas do not matter. And so it can be, you definitely don't have to worry that if you're submitting in an extremely popular category, you don't have a chance. Similarly, if you're choosing a category that is not as popular, again, that's not how it works for STS.
Yeah. And also just to the point that these projects are so interdisciplinary, the computational biology thing, we had a lot of computational projects in the finals that just called themselves something else, right? So entered in another category, but it was really computational work. So don't worry if you kind of fall in that situation as well. Like Elaine said, we have mechanisms that can making sure that people who understand your project will be the ones reading it. Great. And then just two fun ones. We, as you know, if you're working on your application right now, we do collect some interesting data on students just to learn more about the type of students that do well in the competition. And this is certainly not a metric that says you will do well or not, but it is pretty interesting to see the number of languages that are spoken by our top 300 scholars and the top 40 finalists. So many of the students who make it are bilingual or multilingual, which is very cool. So this chart just represents some of the languages that the students speak. Unfortunately, I can't see the notes to count, but it is a pretty impressive number. So maybe you're someone who falls in this category. That's great. Again, it's not a criteria for judging in any way. So don't worry if you don't speak more than one language, but pretty cool stat to see how many do.
All right, and I think the last stat that we have to show you today is just some of the extracurricular activities that our scholars and finalists select. And so important thing to note when you're looking at these two is that students can select more than one activity in the application. We have space for you to select up to 7. And so the totals here don't really equal the number of scholars and finalists. So just background on that. But again, I think some big takeaways here. Although there are definitely trends, surprise, surprise, a lot of our STSers are involved in research. I think there's also a huge variety here. And so like we were talking about earlier, if science activities are really not your thing, but you're super involved in some other hobbies and interests, that's also important for us to know. Similarly, if you've got things like religious obligations, family responsibilities, those are all things that we want to know about and that you have room to talk about in your application. As you can see, all kinds of activities, finalists who participate in all kinds of activities were extremely successful in this process last year.
Yeah, absolutely. It's nice to see even that all the categories are represented in some way. So hopefully you see yourself here in that data. All right, we are going to answer a few questions tonight, but before we do, so please leave them in the chat if you have not already. We also had a few pre-submitted, so we'll address those first. But we wanted to make sure you have this list of resources, which we've shared many ways through the application process, but take a screenshot here just in case you're not familiar. Our homepage has the recordings for all of our past webinars, and we'll have the recording for this session tomorrow. Most questions that you have about STS are probably answered in our application FAQ. So that link accessible through the website is very robust. So if you're working on your application late at night and our customer service email is not answering because we're not a 24 hours kind of service, but we try our best to get back to you as quickly as we can. But most of the time, the answer is probably in that FAQ. So just Control F on the page, search a keyword, you might find the answer while you're waiting for us to respond. So definitely check that out. Same with recommenders. We also have mentioned several times to check out the official rules. Lots of good tips in there. Please do check those out. Our next webinar, Elaine, do you want to talk about that?
Sure, I absolutely do. So we have done 5 or 4, I guess, so far webinars this season, and we have our last and 5th one on November 2nd. And this one's going to be super exciting. So we want to see you all there. We are going to have some finalists stop by from the STS class of 22 to help give you some advice on that application as you make the final push, to talk a little bit about their finals week experience. And so we just cannot wait to hear what they have to say, to get to visit with them again, because of course we get close to them and love seeing them again as well. But definitely want to see you there. And so if you haven't already, make sure to sign up at that link. I'll make sure to pop it in the chat in a minute as well. But we send out links to those 30 minutes in advance of each session. And so we will hope to see you on November 2nd.
Definitely. And then always we encourage you to send questions that you have to sts@societyforscience.org. We have started to staff that up. So we have more staff paying attention during the day, during the evenings, and on the weekends now. So please do email that. It's far better than calling just because we're in a lot of meetings and the account is staffed with multiple people a lot of the time. So that's the best way to get a quick response from our team. And we're happy to help. So please do reach out. And then finally, before we take some of your questions today, we did just want to say that really the biggest accomplishment, not just being a top 300 scholar or top 40 finalist, but is just doing the research that you did, right? So through this process, we hope that reflecting on it in this thoughtful way, the way our application is designed, is in and of itself a rewarding experience for you. We know how much work it is, so we commend you for going through the process. And we hope that at minimum, it's a good learning experience and that you feel like you're really reflected. So in what you've submitted to us. So wanted to make that point that it's not just all about the prizes. The bigger prize really is what you get out of it in the long run, just doing this research project. So good for you. You've already done the work, you're already working on your application. So please be proud of that, because we're proud of you for doing that. All right.
Okay, so I think we will go ahead and start with a few questions here. Let me see, Allie, I can see your screen. I think.
Oh, great. Sorry, I had pulled some of them. I had had them out. So
No
I can read the
worries.
first one that we
Go for it.
received
That's perfect.
earlier today. So some of these are kind of more about the rules, but that's okay, because an important part of making sure you have a winning application is that you followed the rules, right? So the question is, if a study involves a survey, can it be included in an appendix within the paper? It can be. It's going to take up some of your page requirement. Instead, in task 3, if you did a survey and you designed the survey, you're asked to upload it anyways. So know that evaluators and judges can see that, and they often look there to see what you've asked. If you didn't design it, then I do recommend that you put it in the paper as an appendix. That's a good practice. And you can still put it in the appendix if you didn't. If you did design it, like that's fine too, but just know that you're also going to be asked to upload it in task 3.
Awesome. And I think I have the second question here. That looks like, is the table of contents page counted in the page count for the research paper? So kind of along the lines of what we just talked about, you're absolutely welcome to include a table of contents if you like, but that does count toward your ultimate page count. So just be cognizant of that as you're putting that research report together. But good question.
Yeah, and if you have more questions about what can you put in your research report, check out the research report guidelines. They're in the rules book, but also linked separately a whole bunch of places, including on the application FAQ page. And that has a 1.5 pages of tips there. The next question, is the process of your experiment more important than the results in determining whether you're accepted? What are the judging criteria? Well, one, we don't share the criteria, but hopefully you gleaned some good information today and some tips that will be helpful. But the process of doing your experiment is definitely more important to us than the results. We want to know about why you designed your project a certain way. We want to know, like we said earlier, what you learned from it, more than if you produce something that had never been done before or not, right? Sometimes experiments fail, and that's fine, and you can explain it, and that shows a lot about what you did too.
Awesome. Okay, I want to keep an eye on our time, so I'm going to select some questions here that I don't think we've answered yet. If research is being presented at a conference post-submission date, is there a need to mention that in the application? Also a great question. We definitely want to hear about future work too. You're absolutely welcome to let us know what you've got going on in the future. I think we mentioned before that maybe you're in the process of publishing, but that work isn't published yet. You'll definitely want to mention things like that, especially if it bears any similarity to the work that you are submitting to STS, just so we can flag that for when we do our plagiarism screening. So things like that, you'll definitely want to make sure to mention. On that note, though, if something great happens to you in the time that you've submitted your application and you want to let us know, that's really awesome. We'd like to hear it personally, but it's important for us to let you know that it will not be considered as part of your application. So everything that you want to be considered needs to be in that application when you submit it. We don't accept any kind of updates after the deadline.
Absolutely. Next question, do I need to participate in local and state competition to be able to submit my work for competition at STS? No, if this is your first time entering a research competition, that's great. And unlike ISEF, as we mentioned, there's no qualifiers, right, or regional fairs you have to enter. It's direct apply, anyone can apply. On a similar note, can I use a project I submitted last year at the state level ISEF competitions? Totally. You can reuse a project for STS as long as it follows the same rule, or if it's our rules as well, go for it. Great. And I think that answers most of the pre-submitted questions. I don't know if there are any questions in the chat that you're able to see, Elaine.
Yeah, so let me see what I can pull here. Sure, let's go with this one. If you received help from a lab but did the research at home remotely, is that considered a university environment project or a home environment project, Allie?
Good question. You should be able to check both. I would check both on that question, and then you can explain to us how it's both and why. It's important for us to know and acknowledge the support you received from the university lab. But then the fact that you did more of the research at home also is great to know. So I would definitely check both.
All right, and I've got another question here. Are the projects done by mentored students judged more harshly relative to the ones done completely by the student? No, they are not judged more harshly. I don't like that terminology. I would say that it matters to us the level of independence. I think that's something that we've mentioned before. And so it's really important for you to be able to show us that the research that you've done or what part of the research that you've done is really your contribution. That said, again, we totally understand that research is collaborative, especially if you're working in an environment with a mentor, right? And so maybe the idea was handed down to you from a mentor. That's completely fine. We see that all the time, but you'll definitely want to show us the places in which your research was your contribution, places in which you showed creativity and ingenuity. Like that's going to be important for us to see. Similarly, I guess on the opposite side of that issue, if you did your project without a mentor, again, those are just things that it's important for us to know, right? We want to know, that gives us the context that we've been talking about. We're like, hey, it's really impressive that you did X without having a mentor to guide you in that process, right? And so it can go both ways.
Yeah, I would agree that it's definitely not judged more harshly. It's really the opposite, that we're trying to make sure that great projects that had potential are not lost in the process, if you think about it that way. If, especially for a long time, even before COVID, more so, doing research in the lab was like totally the norm. So think about it like that. And no, we don't have criteria that would say you're judged more harshly. That's where it's all about context. So the more you can tell us about that experience, the better.
Awesome. And I think we have time for a couple others. So someone asking, can you upload a published research article as the research report? And if so, are there any changes that you need to make in order to fit the criteria?
Yeah, this is a great question. It comes up a decent amount every year. So if you've published your work, can you upload the same article? It really depends on a couple things. One, how long is it, right? So at minimum, like, make sure that the article, like in the formatting wise, is within the 20-page limit, has the same font size kind of thing. We've seen students that we've had to disqualify try to cram like the smallest font size ever and give us 20 pages of what really was probably like a 35-page article, because they wanted to try to use their full publication, and that didn't bode well for them. So make sure you're still following our rules with what you submit. So that's the first thing. The second thing, if you published with co-authors, I don't always recommend submitting the full original article. This can be discipline specific, because we know that like some disciplines, you're more likely to list like everybody in the lab, and maybe you really were the primary author and this is your paper and your mentor is going to vouch for you. But sometimes it's hard to tell if you don't tell us that, or someone's not telling us that. And then we see like 50 other authors on the paper. We don't know what you did and what the other 49 people did, right? So that's where you got to tell us what actually went down. If you were the sole author, feel free by all means. That's like the perfect scenario to upload. If you were the first author, that's usually pretty good. But if you were one of many authors and you contributed a good part of the paper, but not the whole thing, we don't recommend in those cases to upload that. We recommend to take the bits and pieces. You can certainly cite that paper in your paper. You should still tell us about it. So like Elaine said, if it pops up in our plagiarism checker, that we understand that you were part of this lab and part of this research, you've just pulled out and elaborated on the part that you did. And it gives you more opportunity to do that, right? To talk about the part that you did. So that's what we recommend, so that you have the best chance of, again, showing us what you did. It just depends on the situation.
Okay, I think we will go ahead and take one more question here. Regeneron STS finds students who will become the next leaders in science. But if I don't intend to pursue science research as a career, but have completed science research, should I still apply? Yes, absolutely. Oh my goodness. One of my absolute favorite fun facts about the Science Talent Search is that Natalie Portman was a Science Talent Search scholar. And so she obviously did not become a scientist. She's now a famous actress. That's true for a bunch of our alumni, which we actually have a great utility on our website if you want to check it out, that shows what alumni are up to these days and the amazing things that they've gone on to do. But yes, to really answer your question here, we absolutely want folks who are going to show that creativity, who are going to show that leadership in their careers in the future, even if those careers aren't strictly science-based. If you have done a great research project that you're proud of, we absolutely want to see you apply this year. Great question.
Yeah, I love this question. It really is about identifying future leaders in science, but also science literate citizens and leaders of the world in the future too, right? Like you can still be a leader in science without being a scientist. A great example, Chuck Schumer, Senator Schumer from New York, is an STS alum. He is not a scientist, but that's one example of you could work in politics or the law, all kinds of fields that you might be part of science someday, right? So, or whatever it is you want to do, we think that it's great that you're doing it with a scientific perspective. So, yeah, that's a lot of ways to be a leader in science. good for you. Please do apply. We're totally cool with that. Awesome. Well, thank you all for joining today. We are so excited for you to, as we get closer to the deadline, to share your work with us. We can't wait to read it and see what students are up to in 2022 into the 2023 selection. Wish us luck. Like Dr. Valentine said, it is a hard job. You all make it very difficult because the entries are so strong. And that's not just something we say. It is so true. The months of after the deadline are our busiest of the year because we're going through the selection process and it's very difficult. And so keep up the great work. We know you're going to submit something that's really fantastic. So we wish you luck and we will see you next time on November 2nd. Bye-bye.